So welcome all to, let me go to the slides. There we go, to SoapUI Pro 201 with our presenter, Michael Giller. So before I get started, I want to make sure that you all hear me loud and clear about our first user conference, SmartBear Connect, which will take place in Boston, September 12th and 13th. Day one will consist of live interactive product training class. And for those of you joining today, we have an entire track dedicated to training for our API products. So stay tuned, and we'll definitely talk a little bit more about that towards the end of the class. And then day two will be unique insights from SmartBear customers and industry experts. We have people from Capital One, people from a bunch of companies coming in, sharing their stories. So jam-packed 2 days. Visit smartbear.com/connect. And Michael is going to be taking a very active role as well. So see him virtually here and then kind of take our live class in September. So anything else to add to that, Mike?
No, looking forward to it.
That should be fun.
Yeah, nice and cool in Boston around that time.
So the next one is we are partnering, with obviously the Open API initiative in our Swagger line. And on August 9th, we're going to go run a free Open API training, which kind of means what's the future for Swagger and Open API 3.0. Again, I will include a link to that training, but it'll be a very interactive class again, and you'll kind of learn what Swagger and Open API have on August 9th. So, and any questions on these two programs, feel free to chat. Anything else on that, Mike, that you want to add about the Open API? Big news.
No, it's exciting. I mean, I'll talk about kind of Swagger specification, the way it relates to our testing. So with Open API 3.0, there'll be broader spectrum of different APIs that we can test.
Yep, perfect. And during SmartBear Connect, we do have a day one training, a lot about Swagger, but in Open API. And then the next class, that should say 301, not 201, will be August 15th. So make sure to go ahead and register so you can obtain your SmartBear Academy certificate. So a little bit of a housekeeping comment. Please add your questions to the chat box as depicted on the bottom right of the screen, and we will answer questions periodically through the class. And last but not least, please answer the exit survey so we can learn more about the types of classes you want to see and a little bit more of you as customers. So what do we offer for ReadyAPI training? So if you've attended our 101 class, that's a monthly class, and we're really excited now that we offer it in 3 time zones. We run it here in Somerville, 1 in Galway, and the 3rd in Australia in our new office. So that's a 101 monthly class. And then we run quarterly advanced classes. So today you're in the SoapUI Pro 201 class, and then the 202/301, depending on how you want to view it, will be running on August 15th. But we also have the load and service fee classes. And if you attend 2 consecutive classes a quarter, you will receive a certificate as depicted below. And then we do have a number of premium training through one of our partners, and you can learn that on our website. So we have on-site and on-demand training as well as our SoapUI certificate. So the people here today, Christina Lowe, Customer Marketing, and then Manager of Technical Engineers, Michael Giller, to my side over here. And then before we go through the agenda, we want to learn a little bit about you guys with a very simple poll, and then I'll hand it off to Mike. So here's the poll. So what ReadyAPI module or API product do you yourself currently use? So the options are Soap Pro, Load Pro, Service V Pro, open source, and then if you're not sure, let us know. And again, if you're using multiple modules, select all that apply, so we won't get a straight 100% on this. We're at 60%. I like to go to 70%, and then I will share the results with everyone. And then I promise I'll stop talking so we can get to the training. All right, so we're going to go ahead and close it out and share the results with everyone so you can see kind of your peers that are on the training today. So again, this is our SoapUI Pro 201 class. We'd expect a number of you to be using our Pro product, but that's pretty great to see that you're using some of the other stuff. So load, service fee. And those of you who are not sure, let us know. All right, any comments on that, Mike?
No, there's a good amount of people still using open source, so we'll talk about kind of some of the deltas. Not a bad breakdown of LoadUI, Service V. I'll spend some time just kind of covering everything at high level. Yeah, and then we'll do a deeper dive in SoapUI.
But a great time to see all of the different modules is our 101 class monthly. So, Mike, you want to tell us a little bit about the agenda today, and then I will give you presenting rights.
Absolutely, yeah. So let's switch out from the poll. And in today's agenda, I'm going to give you a background of SoapUI because there's actually literally a decade of history to our SoapUI product and how we span from SoapUI all the way to Swagger, RESTful definitions. We'll actually test some of these by creating tests from definitions. Then we'll talk about how to validate everything, by validating response in many different ways to ensure that you get an automated pass-fail based on your specific criteria. We'll talk about transferring values. So basically, anytime you have a stateful multi-operation transaction, or anytime you find yourself copying and pasting a value from a response somewhere else, we'll talk about how to automate that. Then we'll talk about data and how it pertains to your APIs and your tests. Then we'll talk about really kind of how to, after that, you should have a good idea about how to do a thorough API tests. All right. And from there, we'll talk about how to do these thorough API tests as a team and maintain and collaborate in different API tests. And then finally, the big kind of final goal that we want a lot of our customers to get to is automate tests within CI/CD deployment, because there's a lot of benefits in automating your API tests, right? You'll uncover issues quickly. All of this would be caught with any new check-in. You'll be able to do regression tests and a fraction of a time that you would take in doing manual tests and then uncovering issues that underlie the API level.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and hand over presenter rights to Mike, but again, let's make this class as interactive as possible. We will stop after each topic to answer questions, but enjoy the class, give us feedback, and take it away, Mike.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So you should be seeing still the agenda slide. So this is now on my side. And we'll start with a little bit of SoapUI background. So SoapUI, you can tell from the name SoapUI has has been around for a while. So I think originally it started coding in 2005. I think I finished school by then. So yeah, it was a while ago. And from there we had SoapUI Pro, right? A couple of years later, and then in 2014 we released ReadyAPI. So this is something you might have heard of, ReadyAPI, right? Instead of just SoapUI. So ReadyAPI is a professional suite of products, and we literally this hour had a release 2.1. I did not plan it; it just happened that way. So I've installed this. We're running this. If anything happens, it's very thoroughly tested. I don't foresee anything, but this is a brand new release that literally came out. So if you're following along, you're probably on a slightly older version. After this session, right, make sure you can follow through on this session, but after the session, go to help and then check for updates, and you should see the 2.1 is available. So download, make sure you're on the latest one.
And you will get communication. We will be running a very detailed ReadyAPI 2.1 training. Will have different documentation, and you will get an email about this. But
perfect.
You guys on this call are getting an even deeper, faster preview.
Yeah. So ReadyAPI is kind of a catch-all platform for what we call API quality. Okay, and then we break down that quality into a couple of different areas. So SoapUI Pro, let me change out to a green highlighter. So SoapUI Pro is going to be the focus today, and we think of SoapUI Pro as comprehensive functional API testing. So again, we basically check that the API does work. We can automate very comprehensive test flows. We can automate anything API related, from JSON or XML elements down to schema compliance, assertions, etc. And you should be able to, you'll see data drive, automate, maintain, refactor your tests, share them with the group, etc., etc. So, with kind of coinciding with our poll results, most people, 80–90% of our customers, definitely are very familiar with SoapUI Pro. So we then also have Secure Pro. So that's our ability to do API security testing, right? So security testing is something that allows you to basically do penetration tests directly against the API. So some examples that are pretty common are SQL injection and fuzzing scans. So basically, because we already do functional testing and we understand how the API works, we can understand its parameters and then just throw in different SQL injection screens or payloads, right? Or we can throw in just random data into a fuzzing scan. So there's definitely a lot of different options that you can again, automate and malform and throw against the API with security scan. Okay. Then we have LoadUI and load testing. So this is something that we had roughly, 10 to 15 percent report that they're using kind of on a daily basis, which is great. So LoadUI allows you to do very, very comprehensive load testing, right? So in this case, if your web services, if your APIs are maintained and integrated with hundreds or thousands of concurrent users, you can reuse your end-to-end comprehensive test case, set that up as a load test, set up different load profiles. Again, you can automate this. You can get into every little detail and statistic. If you do have any failures at the very bottom logs, you can check any failures for LoadUI to see, if there's a comparison failure or anything related. So again, very, very comprehensive API load testing, and this allows you to keep all your tests kind of maintained in one place where you configure them, and you don't have to do functional tests in SoapUI and then load tests in some other tool where you duplicate a lot of the work. So there are some questions coming in. I'm doing my best to, I'll do my best to address them. But one thing I want to encourage is do ask questions. So if we can't address them right now, we'll work as a team and we'll follow up on a lot of these questions. So for example, there's a question regarding distribution section. So, you can definitely distribute to different agents, Amazon agents, etc. So all of these products that I covered, SoapUI, Secure, and LoadUI, allow you to test the API, right? So it allows you to test that your API works, that your API is secure, that your API performs very well under heavy load, right? So we act as a client that interacts with your API. And then there's a service V component that allows you to prototype APIs. So this is think of it as the opposite, technically opposite. This is the response for your API. So this is where you can set up kind of a behavior for an API. This is where you can set up a prototype. This is where you can set up, dependency. So if, for example, you're working on your primary API and there's a dependency maintained by a different team or a different company, you can record some traffic, virtualize that API, mock it up, bring it in-house within Service V, and then fill that dependency with full control where you can actually, modify what kind of responses are coming back, right? So you can change out any structure, any item value, any SKU, etc. here, okay? So hopefully this overview was useful. There are some questions that ask me to kind of do a deeper dive in setting up a security test showing a distribution. So Christina, there are academies that, definitely addressed load testing and security testing. Christina will follow up and share with the recording for those academies or with the calendar schedule for the upcoming academies.
Absolutely.
Excellent.
And this page right here is probably your best resource which lists off, I just added it, SmartBear Academy API classes. We do have a LoadUI specific test class coming up. So just a good page. Actually, Mike's depicting it right there. Thanks, Mike. Mm-hmm. So, go there, bookmark that page, and you can also reach out to us at customers@smartbear.com if you have specific requests for classes.
Excellent. Hopefully this gives you a really good understanding of everything that we do when it addresses API quality, right? Because, it's a really pet peeve of mine, but, a lot of people that I talk to in the industry, they go, oh, API is just request response. The response comes back, right? It's so much more than that. It's data behind the response. It's the functionality. It's actually, does it change data behind the scenes? Does it scale? Is it secure? Because if you treat it as a request response, you can, expose security vulnerabilities. You can expose any kind of issues that will bubble up to an end user through integrations or through, different ecosystem when that involves your service-oriented architecture approach. So today, again, we're going to really focus on how we test the API. So our test is going to involve, different ways to interact with an API, but we are going to start creating a functional test, right? So one thing you're seeing is I am on the dashboard, meaning, I'm seeing the overview of everything that I could be doing today. And there's a new wizard to help me with new tests. Okay, so meaning we can set up new functional tests. So there's a couple of different options. I want to show you how you can create definitions from Swagger. So actually, I'll show you this in just a moment. And then I'm also going to show you, how you can create tests from different REST APIs. And of course, there's also an option to do this from WSDL. So I'm quickly going to show you how to do it from each one. I think for my first example, this is the most common that I see in my demos and requests from customers. We're going to start with URLs and with different REST endpoints, right, and how to start testing those really quickly. So if you just have REST endpoints, which, based on my experience, a lot of the customers are starting to see, you can actually add those as REST endpoints here. Okay, so for my example, for my demo, I'm going to use two different Google APIs. So one is going to address books. So right now this is searching any book related to Turing subject. Okay, and then the second one is going to address maps. So this is going to now be a post HTTP call against Google Maps where we're going to look up Boston as an address. Okay. Next, we're going to create a single test case with both of those steps, and then we'll finish this up and then run the test. So this wizard actually skipped over a bunch of steps. What it did behind the scenes is it created a REST project 1, which you can see right in the navigator. In the projects tab, that same REST project 1 actually broke down the understanding, sort of the description of the API. So this is where we kind of tell this that this is a get method, it has a query string parameter, right, versus a resource or a header or anything else. And then from there, it actually auto-created a step in a test case for you, right? So in the SoapUI, we have a test case with 2 steps. And then the first one is, looking at books. So I'm going to rename it as such. So this is going to be a books step, right? The second one is a maps step. So you can see, by going from the wizard, pointing to different endpoints, we're able to create a test case really quickly. So this is a way for us to create a test from URL. Okay, so this is a very, very common path. Another path that is definitely also possible, and at this point we're going to just append it to an existing project, is you can do it from a descriptor. So for example, if you're working with SOAP, right, you would add in something from WSDL. So here, maybe I'm going to point to a local WSDL that I have running from my API. Sorry, I lost my mouse cursor for a second. So I'm pointing to a hosted WSDL. Again, it could be a local file. I can import it. I can understand all the different operations. So here, for example, I can check a login. I can add it to a test case. So this can be a new test case for SOAP, okay, with the first step being login. So again, what I basically did is in the project, I understood how the SOAP API works by pointing to its service contract, its WSDL descriptor, parsing that in. I'm sorry. And then after I parse that in, I'm creating a test case that later will have a sequence of steps, validation rules, and automation rules as well. Okay? And then finally, if you happen to adopt Swagger, so Swagger is awesome. It's a descriptor for REST APIs. It's optional, but it's adopted by, Amazon's and Microsoft's and all the massive giants. It allows you to create documentation. It allows you to create SDKs. It allows you to do some code gen around it, right? It also allows you to import Swagger definitions for faster testing. So for example, if you point to some Swagger definition, let me give you an example. So there's a public example with pet store, right? So there's a Swagger JSON definition behind it, right? This is documentation where you can post pets, get, retrieve, etc. So rather than posting all the different endpoints that are available and importing them in, you can just go into ReadyAPI and then add import Swagger, paste in a link towards it, and then understand how all these Swagger APIs, work together. So here we can say when you add a pet, right? This is going to be a new test case. So we can add pet. Whoops, sorry, I want to add it to test case for create new test case. This is going to be Swagger example. and add pet is going to be the first step. Okay, so what I've basically shown you are 3 different ways to start a test. Okay, so I spent a little extra time on creating a test from definition and URL, because as you can see, all those options are possible, right? Whether you're still working with SOAP, which we very much support, and we have a lot of customers using, import a WSDL descriptor and then start creating tests from that. Whether you simply have endpoints, point to those URLs, and then test those from endpoints. So this is an example we did originally from maps. Or whether you're testing different pets, right, or Swagger definitions, you can just import that Swagger definition. And another benefit of adopting a descriptor like Swagger is, I'll show you how to create tests. If that API changes down the line, you can actually refactor those definitions and roll out the change to all your tests, right? So this not only helps you to start creating tests faster, right? Then you'll be able to also refactor and maintain those tests as the definition evolves, as the APIs evolve, right? So there's a lot of different options. I know I went through it really quickly, and there's a request, to show some of these steps again. For the sake of time, I will move along, but we are recording this session, and we will follow up with the recording to the users. So definitely, feel free to go back to the recording, review the steps. A lot of it is basically in the projects, adding some kind of definition understanding, and then combine that in a test case. Okay, so now let's validate it. And again, I have a lot of different options. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to stick with the REST option for pet store. So we're going to add, look at and delete different pet inputs. So from a Swagger definition, you can see in the projects, right, we understand that this is a post parameter, and we're actually constructing payload based on this definition. So this is all reflected in SoapUI. So when we submit a pet, let's put an example of 1, 2, 3 Academy pet, right? We send this request, we get this response saying we created a pet, this is a 200 OK message. So this is the response we got directly from an API. At this point, we need to add rules to say, is this response correct, right? Because visually, you can look at it, I can look at it, and I can say, this looks correct, right? But if you want to automate this, we should be able to flag it if it's incorrect. So if you look at assertions, there are different assertions available, all right? So there's tons of them. And I would encourage you to look through all these different options and see exactly what applies to you. Okay, but there's stuff like compliance against, headers and schema compliance, etc. So you can say, we need a valid status code, so the response needs to be 200. So you can specify that as an assertion. We can add an assertion for SLA, and we can say, well, the response needs to be quick. So let's give it, half a second, so 500 milliseconds. And you can see this response came back in 35 milliseconds. And then my favorite, most specific type of assertion, right, is down to an element. So we can say this name or this ID needs to exist. So we can just right-click on this element and say add assertion for existence. You can see this is actually, let me do it to a nested one. Let me do it to a name for Academy Pet. So we'll say name needs to exist. So you can see we can auto-generate JSON path down to category name JSON element. And we can say we expect this to exist. Okay, so now through a right-click, by basically going to Outline Editor and looking at a very, very specific element, we can add assertions for its value, for whether or not it exists, and then we can flag it accordingly, right? So for example, if let's go name 1, right? If I submit this other name 1, and you can see that category name no longer exists, we just have name at a different layer, we actually flagged it as failed because a very, very specific JSON element we were looking for did not exist, right? So this gives us, as you can see, very, very specific detail on whether or not the data in the response is what we expect. So definitely I would urge you to do right-click and add assertions for a JSON element. By the way, if you're using SOAP and if you're testing XML in SOAP or REST, right, it's the same kind of concept. So if you get an XML session ID, for example, you can say this element needs to exist, right? In this case, we'll auto-generate XPath if you're using XML instead of JSON. So excellent. So there's a question about how we store it and save it. I'm going to address that in about 15 minutes. So the next thing, so this hopefully gives you a really good idea about how we validate the response, because validation, as I find, is something very specific. And a lot of people, again, I find are saying, like, I expect a 200 response. As you often see, that doesn't get down to a layer element, right? That's like saying, well, I look at a web page and I expect 200 response. Your elements might be garbled, it might not make sense, right? So you have to get a lot more granular, and you actually have to look at elements and values and make sure that those values make sense. So again, there's a lot of different assertions you can do. If you want to combine stuff, there's very quick Groovy scripts you can, write or auto-generate components of. So there's a lot. The next thing that I often see, so we added this pet, right? Let's make sure that we added this pet. So we can say, well, in this project, we have add pet. We also have a get pet by ID. Okay, so here we're going to find a pet, and we're going to add this to an existing Swagger test case. So this is going to be a second step, right? So we already added a pet. We're validating that call. And then for the second one, we're going to say, here's what's going on. So here we need a pet ID. So what you would do right now is, look at, okay, we added a pet. Here's pet ID 123. Let's get that into the following one. So right now it's probably a copy and paste action. What you can do in the professional version is go to an element. So for example, this ID gets into the resource, and right-click, link it to a previous step, which in this case, in Swagger test case, add pet response. And then look at the last cached response for the ID. Okay, so now you can see this actually kind of builds a mapper to a previous response ID element. And now we're going to substitute 123 in the resource of this link because we understood, the structure of it from Swagger. Okay. So yeah, so then we can, check that this element exists. So that's rather straightforward. So, and at this point, again, we can say, well, this needs to be this ID needs to exist, or we can say, you know what, this ID needs to be something, right? Not 123. It might be different value at some other point. So we can say the ID element in the response needs to be what we add pet in ID response. We should have selected an ID as well. So you can say it needs to be test case Swagger, add pet response, ID 123. Okay, so we can say this ID needs to be the same as the previous response ID. Right, so you can get very, very granular down to that.
So Mike, you want to look at some of the questions?
Yeah, there's a lot of questions.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So why don't we're going to take a moment here and look at some of the questions, and Mike's going to do his best to summarize some of them. But we are going to create a community. And again, if you haven't been to our community, I'll include a link, but kind of an FAQ from today's training. We're going to put that in the community. We did it for our Groovy scripting classes. Yeah. Very well received. So,
and before I jump into questions, so let me just kind of finish this thing up, right? So transfer values. So this is something that, basically either right-click or click on a value. So for example, again, if you look at books, you want to get this title into the next post, right? So you can say title. So even in here, just, you'll be able to right-click, get data, go to a previous step, get a book's response, title element, right? So there's a lot of options. This will definitely let you kind of pass values through as they get updated. And again, you can build a lot of different kind of sequences. So for example, here you add get pet, and that is final step. Maybe you want to delete pet, right? So that can be a final step in your test case, and then so you'll be able to close out the and then you'll be able to delete pet and close out the flow within your Swagger test case. So it does require, as you can see with my right clicking and jumping between projects in SoapUI, a little bit of understanding how these things work. But once you do, you'll be able to literally sequence these steps, right? Point to previous pet IDs very easily, and then that will help you really build very sophisticated tests with no coding. So this way, even if you're a coder, right, building a sequence like this to ensure that you got a 200 message when you did a proper delete, right, this will require a good amount of coding. And here you can see you can mainly, just type things in, configure them, and ensure the whole transfer and end-to-end sequence works. So this way, for example, if we're now adding pet 456, right, that whole sequence can flow through, and then we can get and delete pet with a value 456. So very important to transfer values and really think of kind of the sequence of API calls that will happen when your end users invoke these APIs. Okay, let me look at a very big list of questions. I'm going to do my best to kind of summarize some of them. So script assertions are very, very powerful, right? So I kind of mentioned that. So you can do anything there, right? So if you add a script assertion, a couple of things I wanted to show you.
What is this question, Mike?
So there's a question. I'm probably like 20 questions up at this point. So for Groovy scripting, by the way, we also did a great webinar. But the short of it is, in a Groovy script, you can still use right-click get data to select an element. So that's one thing I definitely wanted to show you, right? So you can definitely select ID stored in a variable. And then within Groovy scripting, we also allow you to do code completion, right? So this will definitely give you a lot more flexibility around kind of typing things out and making sure that you're asserting on the right thing. So this way, if you want to assert that ID is between certain condition, you can write a Groovy script for that. You can see with with the right-click get data and CodeGen, you can do some powerful stuff there.
Great, and I included a link to the Groovy scripting class that
perfect.
Jessica ran. It was fantastic.
How can you assert that a response is an attachment? So I think, again, there's a lot of different options. If you look through all the different options, I think there's a binary contains assertion. So equals binary, that might check for a very specific attachment coming back in the response. Okay. If you have multiple nodes with the same element, I mean, we're looking down to a very specific node. So if you have a different node, it should be, node 1, node 2. If you need to iterate through the nodes, we definitely have a feature from that. There's a great question. Do tests created in SoapUI Pro work in SoapUI open source? No. It works the other way. If you create an open source, you can load it in Pro. But from going from Pro back to open source, it won't see the functionality that we use for Pro tests.
Excellent.
There's a lot of questions about repository kind of team use. I promise that's a very important thing. I'll address that in about 5 to 10 minutes. There's a question about how do you what if contains is in the same request? Or one other thing you can do is you can actually clone assertions. So if you're reusing something in a couple of different ways, you can clone an assertion. There's also an assertion test step. Okay, so we haven't gotten into that. We've shown you only SOAP and REST steps, but I'll show you data-driven, data source step. There's a Groovy script step that again has code completion and debugging that allows you to do that. And there is an assertion test step where you can actually combine different assertions for different steps, responses, etc. Right? So we can say response contains 1 to 3. And here you will be actually able to group and combine and sort of union and do and or operations for different assertions within the step. Okay, so there's flexibility around that. So yeah, there's a lot more advanced questions. So let's kind of move along because we have 25 minutes left. We're about halfway through. We still need to talk about data-driven. So basically adding data into your tests, sharing them within teams because that's a very common question, and then how to automate all of this within CI/CD.
Great. And I'm going to go ahead and already practically create a community conversation from this class so we can keep the conversation going. So
excellent.
Carry on.
Excellent. So at this point, you can see we were able to add, get, and delete a pet with its ID and name by typing it in once and flowing through a different sequence, right? But in this case, we're doing that sequence of steps for a pet, right? So what we can do is we can add a step called data source, and that allows us to work with a bunch of data. So think about columns, whether it's a database, table, or files. So I'm going to add a data source. I'm going to kind of go through some defaults, but we're going to modify some of this. So the first step that was added is a data source step. Okay, and here are different options. So we can actually generate data. We can do, connection to a database through JDBC. And for my purposes of a demo, I'm going to connect to an Excel file, and I happen to have a file of. I happen to have a lot of Excel files. This is going to be pets related. So pets. I'm going to import the properties from that file, and then we'll start looking at cell A2. So let me open the file to kind of show you what data I am working with. So when you see it open up, you'll sort of kind of see how the data maps to the test. Okay, so here you can see we have 4 columns. We have ID, type of pet, name of pet, and then assert column. Okay, so we are getting in all of that data into our test, right? So I'm skipping the column headers, and we're looking at all of that data here. The next thing we should do is go to add pet and map that data. Okay, so for the ID, we're going to right-click and get data and map it to a previous step, which in this case is a data source ID. Okay, I'm going to do the same for name. So I'm actually going to do a right-click get data and map it to a name. So I won't worry about the type right now. Okay, but again, the 4th column we had was for assert, right? So what I'm trying to say is this assert column should be the same as the ID, right? Notice that this piece is not, right? Here we have 789 and 987, so I'm actually looking for a mismatch. And this is another great question that I hadn't addressed earlier was, what happens if there is a mismatch? What happens if there is a failure? So we'll show you exactly what happens. So in order for me to map an assertion, I can say ID needs to be, right, we'll add an assertion for content, and instead of hard coding 456 as a value, we can say it needs to be data source property assert. So at runtime, it's going to iterate through every record. So at runtime, data source goes in, fetches a record, populates the record properties into add pet operation, validates against the response. The data source loop is a different step that says go back and increment data source and go back to this add pet request step. Okay? If I move this down, then for every record, we're going to get a sequence of steps. Right? So that's it. That's a whole data-driven setup. In this transaction, we can now flow through different inputs. Right? And here we can see there's a mismatch because of in this step, we expected value 987, but it was actually 789. Right? So we were able to go through all of these steps in 1/3 of a second to go through all these sequences of steps for feeding in different different pets in different operations and removing them sequentially. And now we have a failure. So what do? The best way is create a report, right? So if you have a failure, create a report. Later I'll show you how to automate it. So you might be showing JUnit report, right? But you should be just showing regular printable test case report. Click OK. And this usually opens up in my other screen. So let me drag it over. But here you can see this is the report for the test that we've created. Okay, so here we have all of the high-level data, and then we can dig into more detail about test steps. we can dig into the actual metrics. So today on August 1st at 11:09 Eastern, I ran a test for 1 second, and we had a failure, right? So I can scroll down, find out exactly what happened. And then for any and every failure, we're going to give you all the information, right? So we're actually going to give you a full request, full response, full message for the comparison. So all of that data is going to be in the report. So that way, if something fails to meet expectations, you can see what kind of request was sent through, what kind of response got back as well. So you can see it's a very detailed report that you can definitely provide to your, API provider, to your development team, to make sure that that information doesn't get lost, okay, or that they have really good information on how to set that up. There's a question, do you need to use Groovy for passing data from data source? Not at all, right? So all we did was right-click get data, and that generated this reference to a data source property. So there was no Groovy, and this is one big thing. So I know, especially people using SoapUI open source, for any level of complexity, you need to get into Groovy, right? Here, with the right-click get data, with passing values, stringing them together with more detailed JSON path and XPath validation, it's very rare for our customers to get into Groovy, right? The only time I see people required to get into Groovy is when their either flows or assertions are very specific, right? So you're not even looking for whether or not an element exists. You want it to exist, and you want it to be between 7 and 12. Right? That's the kind of thing that you would do with a Groovy assertion. But whether or not element is the same as in the previous step, element gets passed through, that stuff can be most of the time set up with the right click. Then there's a question about connecting to PostgreSQL. So we do have that. That's done through a JDBC connection, right? So I've shown you how to set this up from Excel. You can actually do a data connection to a database. You do need a JDBC driver in the bin.ext subdirectory of ReadyAPI. So make sure to have it. And if you upgrade, make sure to move it. Right? But from there, if you write, you should be able to connect. And if you do something like select column 1, column 2 from table 1, right? Then column 1, column 2 will go into each corresponding property. Right, so very straightforward for us to connect to a database, pretty much as straightforward as connecting to an Excel file. There's a question about, is this available in the previous version of ReadyAPI? So yes, everything I've shown you is available in previous version of 2.0. So that's definitely available in there. And there's a great question about, so, I'm showing you this in Windows. We do provide ReadyAPI for Linux and Mac distributions. So those assets, all the tests you're creating, are shareable across all the different platforms. So if you create something in Windows, you can share that with your colleague who's using a Mac, and you can deploy that on a CI, environment that might be running on Linux. So all of our projects and tests are definitely shared across all those different environments. All right, so there's questions about kind of database specific questions. So again, we do that through JDBC, and if you have a very, very specific question to a very specific database, we'll do our best to reach out, but also feel free to contact support because they've seen that issue, and they'll help you specifically. Right now we have a lot of people on the line, so I just want to make sure that our subjects cover, an interest area that addresses most of them.
Yep, absolutely. Right. And feel free to continue to add. I've added a few questions that have come up during the class to the community post, but feel free to add a comment, and I'll make sure that some of Mike and his teams are viewing that post.
Absolutely. All right, so let's quickly run by the agenda. So we talked about, SoapUI, creating different tests from different definitions, right, like Swagger, WSDLs, and URLs, validating responses, transferring values, and building different scenarios when it comes to your API tests, and then add in data, just rows and rows of different data for your test environments. So that way you can actually maintain your different test cases and data related to the test case in Excel's versus scripted custom API tests. Next, I want to talk about how to now share this across the team and scale this to to a team level versus an individual level contribution. Okay, and then later we'll talk about how to bridge all of that and add it into automation. So once you create a number of different tests, right? So right now I've created 3 different test cases in one project. Right now, if I were to save this project, it's going to be saved as a single flat XML file. That is not ideal for source repository, right? Because if I have one file for the whole project, I lock it down, Christina can't use it, and vice versa. So if you look down, I've selected a project, right? There's a property called Composite Project. If you change that property to true instead of false, you can see there's a little icon change. Now saving that very same project turns into a folder. Okay, so now I can save that folder, and each test case, each interface becomes a separate file. So now I can add it to a version control system. I'm hoping you use Git because that's currently our plugin that supports the commit and retrieval and checkout, right, to Git source repository. If you use TFS, if you use Subversion, you would just have to commit and check out external of ReadyAPI. But now that we broke this out into a composite project, I can update this Swagger test case, right, while Christina can maybe update test case 4, and we won't step on each other's toes now because those are separate files, right? So we can check those files out separately, we can check them in separately, and then maintain the whole composite project in a Git repository, up to date for other teammates, other colleagues, and of course for automated execution as well. Okay. So this is honestly, the composite project feature is probably the best way for you to share this project with your colleagues. From there, I'm going to jump directly into automation. So what I would recommend is, set up the composite project, and then within automation, you can check out the latest from that project. So in order for you to run all of these tests, right now in the GUI, I can go to the project level or test case or any kind of level, run this, generate a report, share the results. It's fast-ish, right? This took me about 3 seconds to run, but it's still not automated, right? So we want to add this for any check-in, any commit from a developer to automate, a regression test during CI, or maybe, a smoke test during CI, maybe a regression test during, deployment. So the easiest way for us to automate is through command line. So we have a couple of ways. We have Maven plugin, we have command line. I personally prefer command line just for the ease of setup, okay, but I want to show you how easy it actually is to set up. So if you go into your install directory, and I'm showing you Windows, but for Linux and Mac it's going to be a different path, right? But go to where your ReadyAPI is installed, and then there's a bin folder. Under that folder you have test runner executable. Again, this would be testrunner.bat or .sh. This is the best, fastest way for you to execute a test headlessly in an automated fashion. Okay? So if you map where that file lives, in ReadyAPI you can actually anywhere right-click and find Launch Test Runner from a navigator, right? Then you can specify what test cases you want to run, where test runner is, you can save the project, and then you can generate the report. For automation, it is your best bet to generate JUnit reports in workspace of the automated utility you're using, and I really encourage you to use JUnit XML format report. This is also sometimes called as a Surefire report or JUnit Surefire. It's a very common standard, and I apologize, the exact name escapes me right now. But the short of it is when you launch it, you will run the full command line with all the needed parameters, right? So this is going to run the project we just created, and this is going to generate a report in a consumable XML format for a CI system to take in. Okay, so this is really the path to automation. If you happen to use Jenkins, I want to show you my local setup because this is something that didn't really take me long to to set up. But this is how your API test can now be a stage in your deployment pipeline or in your CI implementation. So for functional testing, in the configure step, right, you can first check out the latest test from Git. So this is something that you would set up over here from source code management. And then you would literally refer to the latest test runner and then provide all the parameters for what specifically you want to run. And maybe it's everything in the project. And then generate the report in the workspace and then pick up the report.xml file as a post-build action. So this is all I had to do to configure the automated running of the tests. This allowed me to kick off and run this test a bunch, get me all the historic data, right? So this has a graceful exit if everything passes. This throws an error if something fails. And if something fails, we can actually go in and see the full detail of why something failed. So we can see the expected value, the actual value, the full request, and the full response of the transaction. Okay, so this is the kind of level of detail that we would provide during automation. And again, if you don't see that, let us know. Reach back out to community, reach back out to support. But you can see this is very easy to configure when you know the right steps and parameters, and very straightforward, right? So this is honestly kind of the fastest path that we've seen people take for creating tests, validating responses for automation, setting up more lifelike scenarios and sequences of API calls, and then adding an extra layer by using that external data for different sort of inputs and validation elements, and then bringing in the team to share the tests with other colleagues, and then automate tests within their CI/CD integration. So with that, we have a couple of minutes left. I'm going to go back to the questions. Give me a minute to kind of read this through. Yeah.
So Mike's going to take a moment, and again, these questions have been fantastic, and we will post some of the Q&A on the community. So, and then also, do you have one? Here's a link to Owen in the conversation. Make sure that you hopefully enroll in the next class on the 15th, so I'll include a link there right now. So go ahead, take it away, Mike.
So this is a number of questions. So there's one about JIRA integration and updating the defect result. So with JIRA, we've seen kind of two different integration points. So one is from within CI itself. So Jenkins can, for example, have a JIRA integration and do an automatic update if something fails. This can also be used to set up an automatic message if a test fails. But then within ReadyAPI, we have this JIRA icon. This allows you to do manual JIRA login, right? So I don't quite have it set up, but if you log into JIRA, so you need to provide what JIRA instance and your credentials. You will then get a form where you can log different JIRA bugs, enhancements, anything related to your product directly without leaving ReadyAPI. Okay. There's a question about writing back to Excel. So that's a great question. So we talked about reading from Excel using a data source step. If you want to write back out, you can use a data sync step. Okay, so this is a way for you to kind of write responses out, write elements from responses out. So we have some information on configuring data sync. So it's really a great way for you to even do some data transforms and export data out and write it out into Excel, into a database, or into any other format.
How about how to monitor APIs?
Yeah. So for monitoring APIs. So we have a way to monitor APIs, and I think I have 2 duplicate plugins installed. But basically, we have a different platform called AlertSite that allows us to run these very sophisticated API tests periodically against typically production APIs, right? So far we've been talking about developing APIs, testing developed APIs, and one thing that we can, we can actually also do is reuse these test cases as monitors, as synthetic monitors against your production APIs. That way, if your API doesn't respond well, so if it's slow, if it doesn't, return the right data, or if it's just down, then that will trigger an alert to your operations team, and then they can, restore the server or fix the issue at that point. So that's definitely a common use case, and it's a great reuse for, transitioning all the test work that was done into post-production and into your operations team.
And we do, the API monitoring is actually powered by our AlertSite tool. So I'll put in a little bit of a additional product description. So performance monitoring for your API.
Yeah. There's a question about reports and composite projects being available in open source. So that's just to be fully clear, that's not available in open source, right? So the data source step is not available in open source. A lot of the integrations, there's no way to generate reports in open source. There's the composite project is also just doesn't work and can't be set up in open source. There's no integration with Git or any other source control system there. You're kind of restricted to one big XML file. There's a lot of questions about Rally integration. So right now we don't have it out of the box, but there's a lot of questions about it. So I'm definitely going to take a note and report that to our product team. There's a lot of questions about recordings for sessions.
Yep. So this session will be recorded, and you'll get a recorded copy from GoToWebinar. But the best place to go for recordings, future trainings is this page /academy, and then we also have a repository of past trainings right here. So let me also add that. I think the best place to go, so that's also a link to a ton of videos that we've produced over the last year or so. So we have 2 minutes to go. I know we want to be kind of respectful of everyone's time here. And again, the class that I definitely would kind of consider rewatching is the Groovy scripting class. I think that was really valuable.
That's a really advanced one. So once you're very comfortable with this, because as you saw, with the right click with data sources, you can create very sophisticated tests. If you need an even greater degree of control over which steps are being executed at runtime, different ranges, global updates, that Groovy class is definitely valuable for that.
Yeah, totally. And let me actually show my screen for a moment. That's fine. So that one's great. And we've also had requests during this class about maybe a dedicated class to assertions. So that's something we'll look into as well to kind of have some of these more. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm trying to.
These, yep, it's right there. It's the last one.
No.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, we'll leave it on SmartBear.
SmartBear Connect, yes, but would love to see you for some live interactive in-person training. Here, I'll put another link to connect. But thank you so much, Mike, for taking the time today and conducting the training. Thank you all for attending. We've had a great amount of people on today. And yeah, so I'm getting some positive feedback that assertions would be a good topic. So we'll keep that in the backlog. But all right. So again, thank you so much for attending our 201 class. Awesome job, Mike. And enjoy the rest of your day. So thank you so much. Oh, wait, we're going to do a high five, Mike.
All right.
So we do.
Almost left your hand in.
And take a moment to answer the exit survey at the end. Very appreciate it. Would very appreciate that. Thank you so much.